Hey everybody, welcome back to another tutorial series, and in this one we're going to be focusing on drawing a young girl using charcoal pencils, and we're also going to be drawing in a blurry background as well. As you can see, I've already got my sketch outline down on the paper, and as always the reference and the sketch outline will be attached so that you can sketch it out for yourself and follow along with this tutorial. Also, the materials list will be in the description so that you can check out all of the materials that I'm using, but remember that you don't have to use the exact same supplies as me. So let's start off by going through the materials that I will be using for this drawing. Because it's a charcoal drawing, there isn't many different supplies or pencils that I'm using, but let's go through what I am using. So in terms of pencils, I always just used two different pencils for my charcoal drawings. I use a H grade pencil and a 2B charcoal pencil. And I am using the two pencils from the Lyra charcoal set. But you don't have to use this specific charcoal set. You can get away with just using a H or a 2B and a 2B charcoal pencil from any set that you have. Or if you can't get those exact values, then just try and get a lighter charcoal pencil and then a darker one for the shadows, so that we can have a range of values in our drawing. So I have two pencils, one for the midtones, so that could be a H grade or a HB, and then have a dark one like a 2B or a 4B. For the large dark shadows, I will be using this charcoal block. So this is just a soft charcoal block, and these are great if you need to cover a large area quickly. So for example, they're great for doing backgrounds. And this is a dark charcoal. It's darker than the two charcoal pencils, so it is also great for getting in the really dark shadows as well. So that is it in terms of the actual charcoal. I'm also going to be using a few blending supplies. So I will be using a blending stump, and I'll be using this to blend out any small details or any pencil strokes that are looking a little bit grainy. Most of the time, however, I will be using brushes to blend out the charcoal. So here I've got two different sizes. They are both Daler Rowney Aquafine round brushes, one in size 4 and one in size 6. So I've just got two different sizes, one for the smallest areas and then one for larger areas to make it faster. Now, you don't have to have these specific paintbrushes. I recommend though having a round paintbrush, and just make sure that you're using one that's quite fluffy. These are just watercolour brushes, old ones that I don't use anymore, but it doesn't have to be anything fancy. As long as it's a round brush and it's quite fluffy, it will work. Also, filbert brushes work well, but I find them more useful for like animal drawings, but I like the fluffier ones for portraits. I'll also be using tissue to blend out larger areas for the background. I won't be doing it in this first part where I'm drawing the face or the hair for the second part. I'll only be using it when we get in the background, because tissue is great for blending out large areas. But any old tissue will do. The softer tissues from tissue boxes work best, but I'll just be using regular toilet paper. For highlights and for erasing mistakes and lifting up the sketch outline, I'll be using a kneaded eraser, and for those intense detailed highlights, I'll be using my Tombow Mono stick eraser. So you can see that this is really tiny, which makes it really good for getting in highlighted details like in the hair or in the eyes. So I recommend having a stick eraser and then a kneaded eraser, which is good for larger highlights, more subtle highlights, and for lifting up the sketch outline. But that is all of the supplies that I will be using. You may see me occasionally using an X-Acto knife as well. I like to use this to cut off the end of my Tombow Mono eraser if it becomes too dirty. So that is another extra supply that I will be using, but that's just an optional one. Okay, so in this first part we are going to be working on drawing in her face, and as you can see, the sketch is quite dark. I wanted to start it off nice and dark so that you could see it on the camera. But before I go in and do all of the shading, I want to make sure that I'm lightening up the sketch for the specific area that I'm going to be working on. Otherwise, it's not as important here as if you were using coloured pencils or pastels or something like that. Basically, you don't want the graphite sketch to shine through, so that's why you definitely want to lighten it up if you're using coloured pencils, because you won't want a grey sketch showing through. But with the charcoal, the reason that I do want to lighten it up is because charcoal and graphite doesn't mix very well. So if you leave your sketch quite dark, for example, the pupils are quite dark here, then when you try and layer charcoal over the top, it won't stick to the paper if there's too much graphite down. So that's why I'm just going to lift up the sketch outline using this kneaded eraser so that it's very faint, so that we can go in and do the shading with the charcoal and so that it can stick to the paper well. I'm only going to be lifting the sketch off of the face to start with, because that is the area we're going to be working on in this specific part. And then I will lighten the sketch for the other areas as we move on to working on them. So I'm simply just dabbing and tapping the kneaded eraser all over the sketch outline for the face, including the side and shape of the face, the outline of the face. And I am tapping rather than wiping the kneaded eraser so that it doesn't lift off too much graphite. If you was to wipe the kneaded eraser, it would lift off too much. So this dabbing motion does a great job at lifting off the excess graphite while still allowing you to see the sketch. And I'm going to do the same thing with the shoulder and the clothing here, because that's what we'll be working on as well in this first part. We'll be getting in this arm and the neck and the clothing. And take your time with this step. Okay, so now that we've done that, I am going to start off by going in and establishing the darkest shadows, and I'll do that using the 2B charcoal pencil. So make sure that your 2B pencil is nice and sharp. I recommend sharpening both of your pencils before you start shading in. And I'm just going to go throughout the face and establish all of the darkest shadows to start off with, as I find that really helps me to judge my other values. Let's start off with the eyes, and you can see that in the reference she's got really nice dark eyes. I'm just going to start off by getting in the pupil. There is a slight highlight at the top of the pupil on this eye, so I am going to miss that out. And remember, you're just using the 2B on the darkest areas for now. It's important to make sure that your pencil's really sharp, because we are drawing in lots of little details. Also, it's really dark around the outside of the iris, right on the outer edge of the iris. And I'm just going to add a tiny bit of shading to the left hand side of the iris where it is a lot more shadowed. You can blow away all of the excess powder if it starts to build up. And then I'm also adding some shadow to the upper lash line, which is very dark in the reference, right down to the inner corner, to the tear duct area. And now, because the 2B pencil is very soft, it will wear down quite quickly, so we'll need to sharpen this pencil quite a lot. Now I'm just going to outline the eyelid crease. And the eyelid is quite dark, especially on the left hand side, so I am going to add some shading using the 2B pencil to the eyelid and to that upper lash line. Still making sure to preserve that little highlight. And don't be scared to go dark and add a lot of this 2B pencil in, because it's so important that we get in these darker shadows. Remember, we're just adding the 2B to the darkest areas as well. We don't need to add this pencil everywhere. I'm going to add a little bit more to the outer edge of the iris. But I'm happy with that first eye for now. So now let's do the same thing with the other eye, again starting off with the pupil. And you can see that because we've gone in and lightened this sketch, the charcoal is able to stick really well to the paper. Again, there's a highlight on the top of the pupil. The left side of this iris is also a lot darker than the right hand side, so we're mostly doing the shading on the left hand side of the iris. Also, don't worry about adding in lots of details for now, because we will be blending all of this out, which will soften it out quite a lot. So if you focus on adding in loads of details, then they will just get blended out. Instead, just focus on getting the values correct, and then we'll add the details in on the next layer once we've blended it out. Again, I'm adding the 2B to the eyelid crease. And in the middle of the eyelid it's quite dark, so I'm just adding some shading towards the middle of the eyelid, thickening up that lash line. And then the bottom lash line is also quite dark, so I'm just adding a bit of the 2B just below where the waterline is. I'm leaving the waterline free of any charcoal for now. I won't get in any of the eyelashes in this first layer. We'll do that in the final stages of drawing the face. Okay, so now I'm looking at the eyebrow. And when I'm getting in the eyebrow, even though we're not focusing on details, I'm still blocking in the eyebrow by doing individual lines that are going in the direction that the eyebrow hairs are growing in, so that they still look natural, and so it doesn't just look like a rectangular block. We want it to look like hairs. And I'm not going to do the whole of the eyebrow with the 2B, because there are certain areas, like in the inner corner here, that are lighter, so I'll be using the H pencil for them. And let's just go over to the other eyebrow and do the same thing. It's darkest here where the hair is covering it a little bit, so it's casting a shadow on the eyebrow. Okay, once again, let's move down to the nose and the darkest part of the nose, and the only part I'm going to use the 2B pencil on is the nostrils. So I'm very carefully sketching in the shape of the nostrils. It's important that you don't draw them too big, otherwise it will look really weird and cartoony. So make sure you sharpen your pencil if you need to before you get in the nostrils. And like I said, that's all I'm doing for the nose. So let's move down to the mouth. And the darkest part of the mouth is the center line where the two lips meet. So I'm just gonna get in that shadow. And then there are other shadows like on the top lip, but they are a little bit lighter, so we'll use the H pencil instead to get them in. Just going over that centre line a little bit more. Another thing that I want to do is just add a dark outline around the face, because if you look at the reference, the hair that touches the skin is very dark. And so the reason why I want to add in this outline before I go in and shade in the skin is that if you've just got white paper that you're looking at, then when you start to shade in the skin, you may think it's dark enough, but then you'll go in and add in all of the dark hair and you'll realize that the skin is too light. So if I add this dark line going around the shape of the face, it will make it easier for us to judge the value for the skin. Make sure to blow away the excess to prevent you smudging it. If there's lots of loose powder around, then it will be a lot easier to smudge. Be very careful as you do this outline. Make sure that you're getting the shape of the face correct. Just add the outline for the moment. We're not focusing on sketching in the hair in this part. Add the outline under the chin. Making sure to pay attention to the little gaps in the hair where the dark outline doesn't continue because it's not the hair. So I'm making sure to miss out those gaps. Okay, and then once we've shaded in the layer for the face and we've done the face, we'll move down to doing the shoulders and the clothing. So we're just going to work on the face for now. So now that we've used the 2B pencil, it's time to go in with the H pencil and start to shade in all of the mid-tones. For example, shade in all of the skin and getting the sides of the nose and the lips and some more shading in the eyes, and then we'll blend it all out. But you can see how adding in those darker values first makes it easier to judge the other tones, especially adding in this outline. Once again, I'm going to start off with the eyes and work my way in the same sort of order. And so I'm just going to add all the shading to the mid-tone areas now. So I'm going to add some more shading in the iris because no part of the iris was left white. I'm also going to add a bit of shading to the eyelid. And you can add a bit of shade into the waterline now using this H pencil. You don't have to shade in everywhere though, because when you go in and blend with the brush, it will naturally blend some of the value to the neighbouring areas. So even if you leave something white, when we blend it out, it won't stay white. So you always have the option of leaving some of the midtones white and then just blending some value on them when we blend it out. So you can see that there's this dark shadow underneath her eyes that I'm just going to shade in. Now a tip for when you're shading is you want to keep it really light, because when we go in and blend it out using the brush, it's going to become really nice and smooth as long as you don't apply a lot of pressure when you do the shading process. If you apply too much pressure, then you might have stubborn pencil lines showing through. But if you shade really nice and evenly and be really careful with it, then when you blend it out using the brush, it will really soften out and everything will become really nice and smooth. So my tips for getting a really nice smooth finish, getting your shading really smooth, is to hold your pencil further back. That means that there's less pressure being applied to the tip of the pencil, and I use the side of the pencil so that it only skims the top of the paper rather than getting into all of the nooks and crannies. And those tips will, those two things will really help you to get nice even shading. Okay, so I've got in that darker shadow under the eyes. I'm just going to add a bit more layering by the inner corner, and when I want to make something darker, I don't apply more pressure, I just go over it a bit more and go in circular motions to build up that value. You can always switch back to the 2B pencil if you need to. For example, I want to add a little bit more 2B to the left hand side of the iris. Now I'm going to go to the other eye. Shading the iris, the upper eyelid. With the white of the eye, there's a bit of shadow on this top corner. And then there's a bit of highlight here, so I'm going to leave that area white. There's also a little bit of highlight right at the top corner and then a bit more here. So there's 3 small highlighted areas. So I'm going to leave them white for now. Also going to shade in the waterline. Remember to keep blowing away all of the little bits. So now let's move down to the nose. There's this dark shadow on the right hand side of the nose. And again there's a little shadow underneath the eye. Keep holding your pencil nice and far back. So if we start by the nostrils, there's quite a bit of shading and shadow underneath the nose by the nostrils. So I'm just going to layer some of this H pencil over the top of the nostrils for this underneath side of the nose. There's also a little bit of shadow above the nostrils. And around the side of the nose as well. There's quite a bit of shadow. Now I'm going to add the shadow that starts at the side of the nose and then kind of loops around to meet with the inner corner of the eye. And it also goes up towards the eyebrow as well. And in the inner corner of the eyebrow. And there we go. Also, there's a little shadow that comes around the side of the nose, and then it goes up a little bit over the top of the nose. There is a highlight in the middle here, so we're going to leave that pretty clear of any shading for now. I'm going to lightly add some of the H pencil everywhere else though. I'm going to go back in with the 2B and just go over the nostrils. And I'm going to shade in a little bit of the 2B just on that side of the nose. Now there is a darker shadow that starts at the side here, then sort of loops down and joins with this shadow that's above the nostril. So let's create that little loop. There we go. Don't worry, these shadows will soften out once we blend them out a bit. So we have got a highlight towards the middle of the nose, which we're going to leave pretty free of any charcoal. There is a shadow between these two eyebrows, so I'm going to add some shading between them. And then the highlights here, so I'm not going to add any pencil to this area. I'm just going to correct the shape of that highlight a little bit. Darken up the shadow by the eye and the eyebrow. Okay, the nose is looking good. Now it just needs to go a little bit wider on this side, so I'm going to add some more shading there and bring the shading below the eye. We may need to switch back over to our 2B pencil in a minute. Now the shading is quite dark underneath this side of the nose. So I'm going to go in with the 2B, just add a little bit of shadow just below the side of the nose. Also by the inner corner of the eye here. Let's add a bit of shadow, a bit of the 2B by the shadow underneath the eyebrow. Let's go in with the H pencil and add a bit of shading underneath the eyebrow on this side. I also want to darken up the shadow in between the two eyebrows. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the mouth. I'm going to start off by adding a layer of the H pencil all over the top lip, because this lip is the darkest. And now it is slightly lighter in the center and then darker at the outer edges, so I'm going to add a bit more layering just around those outer edges. Also just going to add a bit of shadow for the Cupid's bow. Now I'm looking for the darkest areas of the bottom lip, which is just below the center line. And then there's a couple of shadows just down here, but really most of the bottom lip is quite light. So I'm going to leave that area white for now. So now I'm looking around the skin, and there isn't too many areas that are really bright white because her skin is a little bit darker. So I'm going to start off by adding a very light layer of the H pencil over the whole of the skin. Just very lightly, and then we'll build up some darker layers for the shadows. But I just want to add a very light covering of this H pencil all over. And so to make the skin look a nice even colour, make sure to hold that pencil further back and to use the side of the pencil. And I'm going in large oval motions, and then if you notice any areas that are looking a bit too light, then just go over them a little bit more, but keep your pressure exactly the same throughout. So I'm just going to spend the next couple of minutes just repeating this process, shading in the whole of the skin. Rotate your pencil every now and again if it's starting to become too blunt on a specific side. So rotating your pencil every now and again is really important. let's do the same thing for the forehead. And try not to rush this part because it's really important that the skin looks nice and smooth all over and that you don't apply any harsh pencil strokes that are hard to blend out. So keep everything really nice and light at this stage. We've nearly finished. Okay, and so now that we've added a base layer all over the skin, we can go in and start to build up these shadows. Now, if we start on the left side of the face and work our way over, you can see that there's quite a lot of shadow around this section. So on the, just below the cheek, so there's a shadow here. It goes all the way to the corner of the mouth. And then there's a shadow just below the lips for the chin, for the shape of the chin. And there's a shadow that comes around to form the shape of the chin as well on either side. And then we've got quite a dark shadow on the sides of the nose and also on the sides of the forehead. So let's start to shade those in, making sure to pay attention very closely to the shapes of these shadows, because it's really important to get the shape of these shadows correct in order to make the face look a realistic shape. So let's curve the shadow to meet the corner of the mouth. Using circular motions to get it darker without having to apply more pressure. Now let's form the shape of the chin. So curving that shadow round. Under the lips. And down this side. Also look for the really subtle shadows as well, because those are going to really help to make your drawing look more realistic. So this is why it was important to do that outline before we shaded in the skin, because if we didn't, then we probably wouldn't be shading this dark to start off with. Whereas adding in that line just helps us to see that we do need to go quite dark. Add a bit more shading below the eye. That area can go a bit darker. And don't worry if you get something a little bit too dark, because we can use the erasers to lift up some highlights if we need to. Adding that darker shadow below the eye, making it a little bit bigger. Really need to darken up just to the side of the eye here, because this area is very dark. We can even go in a minute and just add some of the 2B to make this a bit darker. Darken up the waterline for this eye. Adding some shadow just below the nose and on the right hand side here. And remember, you don't have to do all of the shading, adding all of the shadows in this first layer. You can wait until you've blended it out and see where you want to go a bit darker. Now with the forehead, we definitely need to add a lot of shadow to the sides of the forehead. And there is a little bit of a highlight just above the eyebrow here, but then it goes into a shadow on this side. But around the inner corner, there's a bit of a highlight just here. Okay, we need to add a nice dark shadow. Okay, so we're nearly done with adding the shading to the skin. I just want to go a little bit darker in a few areas, so I'm switching over to my 2B and I'm going to add a bit of shadow just next to the chin to form the shape of the chin a bit better. And just darken up this whole shadow a bit more. The shadow under the lips where it's curving round to make the shape of the chin. Also going to add some more shading to the center of the mouth. And as you start to get in the shadows for the skin, you may notice that certain features that you've already drawn in, like the eyes, you may need to add in a bit more shading with the 2B. Add in a bit of shadow for the side of the face. And I definitely need to make the eyebrows darker. So I'm applying more pressure to my 2B pencil. And on the other side. Also the side of the eyes needs to go a lot darker here. So I'm looking for all of the areas that need to go a little bit darker still. Like the nostrils. Okay, so I'm just going to sharpen my 2B pencil because I want to darken up the eyes a bit more. Because we need to add in some sharp details, it's important to make sure that your pencil's nice and sharp. I really just want to darken up the iris and the lash lines a bit more. Make sure I've got the shape of the eye accurate. Darken up the eyelid crease. And do the same thing with the other eye. Darken up the pupil and the shape of the iris. I want to thicken up the lash line. Keep blowing away all of the excess powder. See, already that looks a lot better. Leave space for the waterline. Because the waterline isn't the darkest part, it's a little bit darker just under the waterline. I'm going to switch over to the H pencil and just add a bit more shading just between the eyes and the eyebrow. Let's just darken up the eyebrow a little bit more. Okay, now I'm going to just add some shading to the neck, and the neck is pretty much black. So I'm just going to shade it in with the 2B pencil. Just applying a lot of pressure. Blow away the excess. Just looking around, seeing if there's anywhere else that I want to add a bit more shading to. I think I'm happy with how it looks for now, so it's time to go in and blend it out with the brush. Okay, so now I'm going to go in with the smaller round brush, so this is the size 4 one, and I'm just going to go in and go in circular motions all the way around the skin to start off with, and just blend it out, and you'll see how nicely it's blending out with this brush. And I'm starting to blend the lightest areas first. And then I'll move on to blending over those dark areas, because I don't want to blend too much charcoal into the lighter highlights. Otherwise we won't be able to tell very well where the highlights are. And I still want the highlights to remain nice and light. So this brush is great for blending the skin. You can use it to blend over the eyes as well if you want to, but you could also use the blending stump to blend the eyes if you prefer. So you can see how smooth the skin looks. Really nice and smooth. So now I'm working on blending over the shadows. So be very careful when you're blending out the darkest areas. Be careful of where you're blending them to, because you don't want to add lots of charcoal to some light highlights. Gonna blend over the lips. Blend over the eyebrows. I'm going to tap over the eyes and blend them out. So now we've got a base layer down on the skin. All we need to do now is add some details and highlights, and then the face will be done. So I'm just going to sharpen both of my pencils so that they're nice and sharp, because when we're adding details we want to make sure that we're able to get nice crisp lines. So sharpen both of your pencils. Now, I hope you're happy with how the base of your drawing is looking so far. I'm just using the sharpener from the Lyra charcoal set to sharpen these pencils. And as you can see, they're both nice and sharp now. And I'm going to repeat the same process of going in with the 2B pencil to start off with. And let's just darken up those shadows again. So when you blend out with the brush, it can lighten up some of your shadows a bit. So it's good to go in and darken them back up. and also add any details that you need to, like the eyelashes. I'm going to add the eyelashes once we've done the highlights. Now you can blend as you go when you do this process. So if you add a bit of the 2B pencil and then want to soften it out, at this stage you can go and do both at the same time. So add a little bit of shading and then blend it with the brush if you need to. Don't feel like you have to blend out every part though. There's some areas that you want to have a nice crisp edge to them, like the details for the eyes. But if you're adding shadows to the skin, then you may want to blend them out with the brush as you go. So I'm darkening up the eyebrows, and because we're adding details, I'm going in and adding some individual eyebrow hairs. To make it look more realistic. Darken up the shadow on the side of the forehead, and because this is the skin, this is one that I want to soften out. Moving on to this side of the forehead. And blend all of this out. You can go in with the blending stump and blend over small details instead of using the brush. Now I'm going to go over this other eye. I'm not too worried about smudging into the background, that will be really easy to lift up in a minute. Let's darken up the lash line. And the eyelid crease. Also we need to add a lot of shadow underneath the waterline. To blend out this shadow with the blending stump. I'm going to soften out this shadow here. Okay, let's move down to the nose. I'm going to go over the nostrils, because they are the darkest parts, and then this little bit of the nose connecting the nostrils is also quite dark. And then above the left nostril, there's a bit of a shadow that I want to darken up. And on the outside of this side of the nose, needs to go a bit darker. Darken up the Cupid's bow. Just darken up under the lips as well. Paying even closer attention to the shape of these shadows now that we're working on adding in the finer details. Darken up the shadow underneath this eye. You can see that it's slowly becoming closer and closer to the reference image. You can see that I'm jumping around quite a lot as I notice an area that needs to go a bit darker. So switching back over to the brush, and let's blend over these shadows. Once again, just blending over the nose. Darkening up the side of the face as well. And you may need to tweak areas and darken up areas that I'm not darkening up, and then I may be darkening up certain areas that are already dark enough in your drawing. So try and analyse your own drawing and see where you want to adjust and tweak. So now I'm just going to switch on to using the H pencil. Just use this for the subtle shadows for areas I need to just get a little bit darker. I do just want to add a bit more of the 2B pencil to the lips. Need to darken up the centre of the lips. Add a bit of shadow just above this outer corner of the mouth. Let that shadow curve down. And it's really important to look at how the shadows link together and how they connect. Once again, I'm just going to soften that out with the brush. Now I'm going to go in with the blending stump and just use it to add a bit of shadow just to the white of the eyes. And just keep adjusting the shadows until you're happy with how it looks. Softening out the side of the nose. And if you want to keep the shading a bit darker, then you can always use your fingers to blend it out. I only use my fingers to blend out the darkest shadows because you don't want to end up getting smudges and fingerprints on any of the lighter areas. Just using the H pencil now. And I'm just going to use the H pencil to add a bit of texture to the lips. A few little cracks. Make sure you're following the curve of the lips as you do these. Okay, now I'm going to go in and start to add in some of the highlights using the Tombow Mono Eraser, and then I'll go in and add final details that I need to, like the eyelashes. So before I add in the highlights, I'm going to cut off the end of my eraser so that it's a nice clean edge using my X-Acto knife. There we go. And I'm going to start off by adding in the highlights to the eyes. So I'm going to brighten up that highlight just at the top of the pupil in both eyes. And there's also a couple of highlights within the iris, especially on this right eye. I just want to get in, and those highlights continue onto the white of the eye. And you can see that we actually added quite a lot of shading to the white of the eye because it's not actually completely white. You can see how already that eye is popping so much more. I'm also going to add a little bit of highlight just below the eyebrow. And using this eraser is a great way to sculpt out details as well. I'm going to add a little bit of highlight just below the eye, in that inner corner. I'm looking at all of the areas of the skin that need to go a little bit lighter. I'm just using the eraser just to sketch in a couple of highlights within the skin. For example, there's a small highlight right at the side of the face here. Just a subtle highlight. So just to the side of the nose. There's a little highlight. It's really important to get in all of these subtle highlights. Also in the middle of the nose, we've got quite a bright highlight. And just above the left nostril. If you ever get a highlight too bright, then you can just dust over it with the brush to make it a little more subtle. And if you want a brighter highlight, add a bit more pressure to the eraser, and if you want a really subtle highlight, then be very gentle and hardly apply any pressure to the eraser. For example, I want to add a really subtle highlight above the eyebrow, so I'm being very gentle. And like I said, if it gets a bit too light in certain areas, you can always dust over it with the brush. So you really can have a lot of control over this technique. Now there's a little bit of highlight just above the lip that's quite bright, so I'm applying a bit more pressure to get in this highlight. And I'm just going to gently fade it out by getting more and more gradual with my pressure. I'm going to start to add some highlights to the bottom lip, and I'm going to use little lines to help give a realistic texture to the lips. I'm going to add a little bit of highlight in the centre of the top lip, but I'm not going to add too much. Just adding a bit of highlight to the top of the chin. And you really need to look at the shape of the highlights just as much as you did when you added in the shadows. So now I'm going to go in and add in the highlights within this eye. Brightening up the white of the eye a little bit. Adding a bit of highlight to the tear duct and the inner corner of the eye. I'm going to brighten up a little bit. You can always switch back to the charcoal pencils if you notice an area that you need to darken up again, or if you make something a bit too light and you just want to fix it quickly, just like I'm doing here. Brightening up the under eye area just below that shadow. Like I said, if you do feel more comfortable using the kneaded eraser for this step, for some of the more subtle highlights, then you can do that as well. There's also a bit of highlight right at the top of the forehead. And a few highlighted bits of hair. I'm just getting in that highlight. Going to go over that highlight with the brush to soften it out. You can see how going through and adding these highlights has really taken this portrait to the next level. It made it look a lot more accurate to the reference and look a lot more realistic. It also has given it a lot more contrast because you're adding a larger range of values by adding in these highlights. I'm going to add a little bit of highlight just to the neck, right on the right hand side. And I'm going to blend over that with the brush, because I just want it to be very subtle. and go back in with the 2B just to darken up that outline just around the chin. There we go. I'm going to add a bit more highlight by adding a bit more pressure to the eraser. Look for the brightest highlights around the skin and just add a bit more pressure to those areas to get them really nice and bright and to really make them pop. Keep blending over those highlights to soften them out. Nearly done. We're getting in these highlights. Okay, so I'm nearly finished with adding in these highlights. Now I'm just going to sharpen my black pencil, my 2B pencil, so that we can add in the eyelashes. Just brightening up the whites of the eye again. Make sure they're nice and bright. Okay, so I'm just going to sharpen my black pencil my 2B pencil. Why do I keep saying my black pencil? Just get it as sharp as you can. And now I'm just going to carefully sketch in the eyelashes. Try and getting them nice and thin. Keep looking at the reference to see how long they are. And this child's got really nice, thick, dark eyelashes. If you make a mistake, don't worry, you can just go over it with the eraser. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. The bottom eyelashes tend to be more sparse. There tends not to be as many of them. And then the top eyelashes tend to be a lot thicker and longer. Now I'm just fixing any details, making them nice and sharp. To make sure that they stand out as much as possible. Going over the middle of the mouth. And just going over all of the darkest areas again, just to make sure they're as dark as they can get. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how the face looks. So now we can move on to doing the next step, which is going to be the arm and the shoulder. So just look around the face and make sure you're happy with everything before we move on. For this part of the tutorial series, all I'm going to do is get in the shoulder and the clothing and just finish off this part. So I'm going to be using the exact same technique as I did with the face, and I'm going to start off with the 2B pencil and start to get in the darkest areas, which is actually at the top of the shoulder, you can see that there's actually quite a dark shadow where the clothing is overlapping onto the shoulder. So I'm just going to go ahead and block in these darkest areas, making sure to give a bit of a frill to the edge of the shoulder where it meets with the clothing, because the clothing has got that little bit of a frill to it. So I don't just want to do a smooth line, I'm giving it a little bit of a crinkle just to make it more accurate. So if you're unsure where the shoulder ends, then make sure you look at the reference and line it up. In the reference, the end of the shoulder is pretty much in line with the edge of the mouth. So then you can go in, put your pencil there, and then you can see that the shoulder is meant to end around here. So just carrying on, getting in the shadow. It's actually quite a thick shadow. There we go. Pressing quite hard on that 2B pencil to make it as dark as it can get. And I'm also going to outline the clothing at the back, just like we did with the face, where it meets the hair, so that we can evaluate the values a little bit better. Now I'm not going to be working on the bits of hair for the moment. I'll only get in the couple of wispy bits that are going over the top of the clothes here. So we've got this big lock of clothing, big lock of hair, not clothing, big lock of hair going over the clothing here. So let's just sketch that in. And we've got a few folds. And I'm just going to get in a bit of texture into the clothing, getting in these little stripes, looking at how the stripes are curving round with the folds in the fabric. And we're not going to add much with the 2B pencil because a lot of the shading is quite light. And so now I'm switching over to my H pencil, and I'm going to add this all over the back of that top, bringing it round onto the top of her shoulder here. Just add in the little details to the clothing, these little stripes. Adding some more layers because it's quite dark where the hair is overlapping it, because it's not able to get as much light to it. Now I'm going to add some shading to the shoulder. I'm going to add a light layer of shading all over the shoulder here, just like we did with the skin. And then I'll build up the shadows around the sides of the shoulder in a minute. But for now, just getting a nice even layer of shading, going back over any of the light areas to make sure it's nice and even. Now looking around, a lot of the shadow is around the edges, and then it's the brightest in the middle here. So I'm making sure to add the shadow around the sides. Keep looking at the shape and the way the shadows curve. So you can see that I've pretty much added another layer everywhere but that highlighted area at the top. Now I'm going to add a layer of the H pencil onto the clothing. Okay, and now I'm going to go in with my brush and just blend over this whole area. Just to smooth it all out. I'm also going to show you another technique now. So if you ever want to smooth it out a little more, or add in a bit of a highlight, as you can see me doing here, then you can go in with the tissue and that will help to smooth it out even further. And it's great if you have gone a little bit dark and you just want to lighten it up and create a subtle highlight. So now I'm going to go back in with my 2B pencil and repeat the process of going in and replenishing those shadows, making them nice and dark again. All around the top of the shoulder. Adding the details to the clothing. And we can add lots of details to the clothing later on with the Tombow Mono Eraser. They're great for adding texture to the clothing. Adding some more shadow to the back of the top. Just going to outline the hair. And I'm going to switch over to the H pencil and just add a bit more shading to the side of the shoulder, around the sides, darken the sides up a bit more. And around the top. Again, just leaving this area clear of any extra charcoal. Going to go back in with the 2B and just add a few details to the clothing around the back. And I'm just going to brush over the skin a bit more with the brush, blend out that layer of shading. Happy with how that looks now, happy with the values. And I'm just going to blend over the clothing again. Now I'm just going to add one more layer of shadows just to crispen up those darker shadows and make them as dark as they need to be. Okay, and now I'm going to go in and use my Tombow Mono eraser. Blow away the excess bits. And we're just going to use this to add some texture to the clothing, like the little fray bits. I'm just going to chop the end off my eraser. I'm going to add some highlights in between the stripes. I'm just going to go back in with the 2B pencil and just add in a couple of details. Just soften out that shadow. And I'm also going to go in with the H pencil, and I'm going to use the H pencil to add in a couple of the little flyaway hairs that you can see coming down onto the clothing. And make them a bit more subtle using the eraser. Also adding a bit more tone to the clothing because it's not that bright. And I'm going in with the eraser just to brighten up the couple of areas where it is really bright. Okay, so now I'm going to go in with the 2B and just add in the hair that's coming over onto the clothing. So it's quite dark, but then we've got this slightly lighter bit of hair where the light is reflecting more off of it. So I'm not going to add the 2B absolutely everywhere. Blowing away all of the little bits and quickly going back in with the Tombow Mono Eraser just to highlight the clothing a little more. Now I'm just going to go in with the brush and blend out the hair, adding a little bit of value to this area we left white. Okay, now I'm going to switch to the H and just add a bit of detail within this highlighted section of hair, just to give it a bit more texture. Switching back over to the 2B and adding a few darker shadows within this lighter section of hair. And blend it out with the brush again to give it a softer look. Now I'm going to go back in with my Tombow Mono Eraser, cutting off the end to make the lines really nice and crisp. And I'm just going to go in and add in a couple of highlights to this section of hair. Also adding the couple of hairs, highlighted strands that are going into the face. Because we're removing quite a lot of charcoal, we'll need to cut the end off of the eraser a lot more. Now I'm just going to clean up the shape of those highlighted strands of hair using my 2B pencil. And so that is it for this part. In the next part we'll be working on doing the rest of the hair. You can go in with the brush and just darken up any highlights that you feel are too bright. So just keep adjusting the skin and the clothing until you're happy that your values match with the reference. And then once you're happy, you can move on to drawing the hair. So I'll see you guys in the next part. In this part, we're going to focus on drawing in all of the hair, and I'm going to start off on the left hand side and we're going to work on getting in this side of the hair, sketching this in, and then we'll move over to sketching in the right hand side of the hair. So throughout every single part of this series, I'm using the same steps and the same method. So I'm going in with my 2B pencil and we're going to start to get in the darkest areas of the hair. Now this time, because we're drawing in hair, we want to go in lines rather than circular motions, and we want to make sure we're doing nice fluid lines that are going in the direction that the hair is going in. Now each section of hair, because it's curly and wavy, you can see that each section is going in a slightly different direction. So it's really important to keep looking at the reference with each new section that you're drawing in and identify which direction the hair is going in. Now I'm not going to be using this 2B pencil everywhere within the section. I'm just going to use it to get in the darkest areas. However, we will be using this pencil quite a lot because her hair is actually really dark. But with the Tombow Mono Eraser, it's harder to remove highlights if you've already got charcoal directly added to a certain area. So if you shade charcoal, say all over the hair, and then you want to add highlights, it'll be very hard to get nice bright highlights because the charcoal's already ingrained further down into the paper. Whereas if you leave the highlighted areas white, and then just go in with the brush and smooth some value over the top like we have been doing, then it's just a lot easier to remove just the powder than actual charcoal that's really ingrained in the paper. So the reason I'm working on the left side first is because I want to prevent smudging. So if I was to have done the right and then gone and done the left, then my hand would have been resting on the hair that I'd already have done, and so I'd have ended up smudging it. Now you want to make sure that your lines don't look fuzzy, so if your pencil is becoming really blunt, then go and sharpen it. We want our hair to look nice and crisp, but the details need to look nice and crisp. This area here is quite light, so I'm not going to be adding any 2B to this section. You can see that I do jump around quite a lot as I do this. It's okay if you go from one end to the other. So we've got this area down here that's just really dark. So I'm just shading all of this in without going in the direction the hair's going in. But I only ever do this if it's just jet black. However, if we can see the direction the hair is going in, then I make sure to follow it. You do want to avoid doing the scribbly motion if you can. It's always best to do these lines if you want a nice realistic look. So you can see that I've left most of that area white because we will need to do highlights within it later on. Quite a lot of shadow around the side of the face, so let's just scribble that in. Now you don't have to make the hair exactly the same as the reference, just follow the general gist of the direction the hair is going in and how it's flowing and how curly it is. You don't have to get every single strand in the right place for it to still look realistic. Okay, I'm just going to sharpen my pencil and then I'll come back and carry on, because it's getting a little too blunt. And you can see that when I'm drawing the hair, I'm not doing loads of individual strands. I really am focusing on it in terms of clumps. Having in these little loose ones around the sides. And I'm just looking throughout the whole of this hair now that we've pretty much finished this side, and seeing if there's any areas that I need to add more of this 2B pencil to. Pretty happy with how that looks. So I am just going to move over now to the right hand side and repeat the exact same process. Starting at the roots, which are really dark. I'm making sure to leave the little gap here for the parting where we can see the skin through. And I'll blend over that with a brush when we blend out the hair. So I'm just adding the 2B everywhere but the highlights. You don't have to worry about making everything perfect in this stage, because when we blend it out, it will smooth things out and it will give you a little bit of room to tweak anything that doesn't look right. And you can go in and fix anything with the eraser if you need to. There's quite a lot of shadow here, but I can still kind of see the direction the hair's going in, so I'm still going to do it in lines. Same with the side of the face here. Even though I can't really see the direction, I know the direction that it's going in. Most of this side is actually quite dark. There's only a couple of lighter bits of hair. So we're going to be using quite a lot of the 2B pencil on this side. And so I'm just going to continue this exact same process until I've finished adding the shadows throughout the whole of the right hand side of the hair. Just going to sharpen my pencil again. And I'm going to do some of these main flyaway hairs that are going over onto the background. But I'm not going to worry about doing them all because we are going to be doing the background in the next part. And so I'll just add in all of the flyaway hairs once we've done the background. I am doing these bigger clumps of flyaway hairs. Okay, and now that I've done with the 2B, I'm just going to go in with the H pencil and just add in the midtones. And so I'll obviously just be focusing on the highlighted areas when I'm doing this. And I'm just basically adding some texture throughout the highlighted areas. Just doing some lines, following the direction the hair's going in. I'm also going to add a little bit of shading to the parting the same value as the skin. I'm going to switch back over to the 2B and just add a little more shading just here. And now I'm going to go in with my brush and start to blend everything out. For this, I'll switch to the larger brush to make it a little faster. So I'm using the size 6 brush this time. And when I'm blending each section, I make sure to blend in the direction the hair is going in. And you can see that this just blends out and softens out all of those lines to give it a really nice, natural, soft look. And it adds a nice value to those highlighted areas. So I'm just going to repeat this process for the whole of the hair. And you will see that the shadowed areas become a little bit lighter because you're spreading the charcoal powder from those areas onto the highlighted areas. So it's naturally lightening up those shadows a little bit. So we will have to go back in with the 2B and darken them up. Blow away the excess. As you can see, there's a lot of powder because we added a lot of that 2B pencil. So now that that's blended out, we can go back in with the 2B pencil. I'm going to sharpen it and I'll just go in and darken up those shadows. And I'll be using the charcoal block in a minute in some of the darkest areas to give it a really nice dark value. Add some more shadow to this side because this highlight isn't actually that big, and then up here is actually just pretty dark all over, so I'm just going to fill that in. So with the second layer you may notice areas that you need to add more 2B pencil to that you didn't notice in the first layer. So that's why it's good to do multiple layers. And to keep looking over at your reference. You can use your finger to blend out areas if you want to keep the 2B nice and dark. Keep checking, keep looking around. I want to make sure I've added in all of the shadows before I start to add in highlights. Once again, don't worry too much about smudging on the background. We can fix that when we do the background in a minute. Just softening out this area with my fingers. Okay, I'm just going to blend over all of this with my fingers. Okay, and I'm going to go in with the charcoal block and just use this to darken up the darkest areas of the hair even more. Just to give it even more contrast and to really make it pop. So once again, just add this to those darkest areas, which is right by the face. It's really dark. I'm going to repeat the process on the other side. And blend this out with your fingers as well to keep it nice and dark. Okay, I'm just going to blend this out with my fingers. Okay, I'm just quickly going to go in with my tissue and just blend over where I've smudged the background. Now let's go in with the Tombow Mono Eraser and start to get in all of these highlights. Starting off with the left hand side, and most of the highlights are actually at the top of the hair. I cut off the edge of the eraser so that it'll be really nice and effective at creating these highlights. And to start off with, I'm going with the direction the hair is going in and add in those highlights, and then once I've done that I will add loose flyaway strands that are going in different directions all over the hair. But to start off with, I'm just focusing on going with the direction the hair's going in and adding in those highlights. I'm going to chop the end of my eraser off again. You can see how well it lifts up that charcoal because we haven't added the charcoal directly to the paper. We used the brush. Okay, you can see how realistic that has made the hair look. Now I'm going to repeat the same thing on the other side. Once again, if you want to have really harsh, really bright highlights, then apply a bit more pressure to the eraser, and if you just want them to be subtle, then be really light. And I like to be quite fast as I do each bit of hair, especially as I do the flyaway strands of hair. Okay, and so now that I've added in all of the main highlights throughout the hair, I'm going to go in and add in the little ones, the little flyaway hairs. Just going to try and brighten up some of these main highlights even more. Just see if I can get them even brighter. Okay, so I'm just going to cut the end off of the eraser and just go throughout the hair and just add a couple more of these flyaway hairs, especially going over onto the face. I'm also going to go in with the H pencil and add a few darker flyaway hairs going onto the face as well. just help make the portrait look even more interesting. You can tap over the hairs with the eraser if they've gone a bit too dark. Okay, and so that is pretty much it for the hair. You can see that it's not actually that difficult to draw hair. I know it's one of the things that people struggle with the most, but I hope with this technique it becomes a little easier. And so we've only got one more part of this drawing to do, and that's the background. So I'll see you guys in the next part where we finish with the background. In this final part of the tutorial series, we're just going to finish off the background. And what I've done is I've got a little scrap piece of paper and I just rubbed my charcoal block on the paper to give it a bit of powder. And I'm going to start off with a bit of tissue paper. I'm going to wrap it around my finger and I'm going to rub that onto that charcoal. And I'm going to actually apply the charcoal to the paper using the tissue. And I'm going to start over on this side, and I'm just going to use this technique to create the base, as it's a really quick way to get down a basic tone on the paper that we can then build on top of. So the left hand side is actually quite dark, so we can go ahead and rub quite a lot of this charcoal on the paper. Rubbing some more charcoal onto the paper. And so just keep going using this technique until you've added a nice decent amount over the side. And then I'm continuing to blend all on the other side, but I'm being a little more careful because this area is a little lighter than this side. And so this is just to create a base tone that we can then build on top of with pencils. I'm going to go in with some more pencil on my scrap piece of paper. And every now and again I'm switching to a new piece of paper on my fingers because they can break down quite quickly. So now this section here is quite dark, so I'm taking quite a bit of charcoal powder and adding it over here. And using this method with the tissue helps to give it an out of focus look and to give it that blurred look that we're going for. So you can see how the tissue paper starts to break down. Just going to add some more of the charcoal block, and I'm just going to repeat this process until I've added a decent base I want to get the values as close to what they need to be as possible. Okay. So now that we've got in a nice base tone, I am going to start off working some more layers on top of the darkest areas. So I'm starting off with the left hand side, and I'm just going to gently shade the 2B charcoal pencil all over this side, holding the pencil further back and using the side of the pencil so that we get nice even blending, even shading, which is really then easy to blend out. I'm going to take it all the way close to the hair, and then it gets a little bit lighter as we touch the hair, so I'm not going to add the 2B wherever I can see a slight highlight. And then it gets lighter about here. And I'm going to carry on shading. And then to make it even darker, because it's actually quite dark, well, very dark, I'm going to go in with the charcoal block and very gently just add this all over that same area. Once again, missing out any highlights. I'm using the side of the block to help just skim the surface, the top surface of the paper, so that it's really easy to blend out. Don't use the point, otherwise you'll get harsh lines that will show through. So keep using the side. So now I'm going to use my finger to blend this, as we want to keep this as dark as possible. Okay, I'm just going to add a little bit more of the charcoal block to make it even darker. Now I'm going to go in with a bit of tissue and just add in those highlights again. You don't want to lose the highlights. Now I'm just blending over the ones that are a bit more subtle. And I'm going to use the kneaded eraser just on this one that is quite bright. And so now let's move on to the other side. Now that we've got in this area, we'll do the hair in a minute. For now, let's just focus on the background. And so I'm going to repeat the same process of going in with my 2B pencil to start off with. Let's just use the 2B pencil to block in where these darkest shadows are. There's a lot more highlight within this area, so I'm not going to be adding as much 2B. And I will be blending this out with my fingers as well. Try and be very sketchy with this. Don't focus too much on adding lots of detail because we want it to look out of focus. So just repeat this process until you've blocked in all of the shadowed areas. There's not really much to say about this particular step. You don't have to do the background as exactly like the reference. It's up to you if you want to tweak it a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to go in and just shade some of that 2B all over this side, because the whole area needs to go a little bit darker. And I'm going to go in now with the charcoal block. Just using this to get in the darkest areas. I hope you guys like how yours is looking so far. I really like how this is turning out. Okay, nearly done. Just look at the reference, see if there's any areas that you've missed out. It doesn't really matter because you can always go and add in some more layers. Now I am going to use my finger just to soften all of this out. I'm trying to blend it all in the same direction, going sort of back and forth to give it a cool sort of effect. Then you can go in with a tissue. I'm going to go in with a dirty one because I don't want to lighten up my sketch too much. And I'm just going to blend and soften this all out. Now I'm going to go in with a bit more of the Lyra charcoal block and the 2B pencil. I'm just going to add some more layers. And I'm just going to keep building up more and more of the 2B pencil until everything starts to look a bit more blurred out and fuzzy. I'm blending with my fingers to keep it as dark as possible and give it a really smooth look. going to go back in with the charcoal block now. Use this to sketch in where those darkest shadows are again. Blend with my fingers again. So now I'm going to switch over to the tissue and just use, actually I'll use the kneaded eraser just to create these tiny little detailed highlights within these shadowed areas. So we've got a few little lines, a few like streaks, we've got some circles. Okay, I'm going to add in these bright highlights. And we can soften these out in a minute because they do look very bright at the moment. Just going to add a highlight over here. Add a few more highlights in over on this side. Now I'm just going to go in with a clean tissue and just soften this all out. And just blend over it with my finger again. Now I'm going in once more with the kneaded eraser. Going to soften over it with the brush this time. particularly just soften over the edges. And I'm just going to use the Tombow Mono Eraser just to add another layer of the highlights, just to make a couple of them even brighter. Just adding the highlights in between the hair. I'm just going to use a clean finger just to soften over these highlights, just at the edges. Or you can use a clean tissue. Now the final thing that I'm going to do to this drawing to finish it off is just go in and add in those flyaway hairs onto the background. So I'm going to go in with my 2B pencil and just start to sketch in and go over all of the bits of hair that are going into the background, and this will just help to tie these two areas together and make it look like the little girl is part of the background and that she's in this environment. I'm trying to do the loose flyaway hairs really nice and wavy to give a lot of motion to the hair, to make it look really nice and interesting. I made sure my pencils are really nice and sharp for this, so that we've got really nice crisp details. I'll also be using my H pencil to add in some flyaway hairs as well. You can go in with the charcoal block and just add it to any shadows you think need to go a bit darker if you notice anything that you want to adjust. Okay, looking around, seeing if I want to add in any more strands of hair. And make sure when you're drawing the hairs, you don't do them really short. Make sure they're the same length as the whole of the hair. I see a lot of beginners when they're doing flyaway hairs, they just do them really short, whereas they are the same length as the rest of the hair. So make sure that you go in and add them the same length, and you make them the same length as everything else. do some of the flyaway hairs slightly thicker. And then add some thinner ones just to get in a bit of variety. Now I'm going to go in with the H pencil and just add in some lighter ones. And adding some lighter ones will help add depth to the drawing. Okay, and finally I'm going to go in with my Tombow Mono Eraser. I'm just going to add some highlighted flyaway hairs, especially over on this side, where it's against a really dark background. There's a few lighter strands showing up against that dark background. You can also go over any highlights that you think need to just get a bit brighter, because when we do the background and we've blown around all of the charcoal powder, it could have accidentally gone on some of the highlights and in the clothing and on the face, so you can just go in if you need to and just brighten up any of those highlights again, just to make them really pop and stand out as much as you need them to. Add a bit of highlight to the top of the shoulder. I am quickly going to go back to the 2B pencil . And I'm just going to thicken up this flyaway hair. Okay, so that is it for this portrait. I really hope you like how yours turned out. I'm really happy with the final result. I think it looks really cool, and I love the dramatic look of the background. Just check to see if your values are accurate. I'm just going to use my brush to blend the hair in with the background, and I'm just going to go over it with the 2B just to add in those shadows again. Going in with the charcoal block now to make sure it's really nice and dark. Okay, so that is it for this tutorial. I really hope you guys enjoyed following along, and like I said, I hope you like how yours turned out. I'm just going in and making sure that the highlights aren't too bright, otherwise it will look unrealistic. So I'm just adding a bit more shadow to a couple of the highlighted areas. Look back over the face. Is there any areas that you want to quickly darken up? But there we go. That is it for this drawing, and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Bye everybody.